right, let me just say the next couple hours is truly incredible. I mean, we would have never had this when we first started, because the next couple of hours we're going to have someone talk to us about clinical trials, the ins and outs, and then four companies working on treatments for ALD, with one of them even having one on the market. So this is huge, huge. I mean, we've come a long way, really. This is a momentous time. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to have Zarin Tasnim, who is a health literacy project manager at the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation out of Boston, really explain to us more about clinical trials, and then we'll have a representative from 4 different companies talking about the work they're doing for ALD. Thank you.
So yes, I'm Zarin. I'm from SysScript. It's a really long name, and we typically go by SysScript just for ease. But I'm here today to talk to you about clinical trial basics. So we've had some technical presentations. So mine is a very stripped back version, just going back to the basics of clinical trials and what they are, and just some other relevant information that we thought would be relevant for this patient population. So I'm going to jump into the agenda. So I'll continue on with an introduction for the next couple slides, and then we'll jump into the content. Part 1 will cover what are clinical trials. Part 2 will touch on expanded access programs. Part 3 will talk about clinical trial delays, and Part 4 will talk about any other challenges that clinical trials may face. And then we'll have some closing notes and maybe time for questions at the end. So before we jump into the content, I wanted to kind of get a temperature check of like where people stand with understanding of the term clinical trial or clinical study. And I know we have a mix of professionals and patients and caregivers. So for those that understand the term clinical trial or clinical study a little or somewhat, can you please raise your hand? Great. Thank you. And then for those that have a very good understanding of clinical trials and clinical studies. Amazing. So I hope that, for those that are very aware of what clinical trials are and what clinical studies are, that, this is a good refresher for everyone. And then those that don't have as much of an understanding, that I hope you take away some good general knowledge about clinical trials here. Next, I wanted to touch on some glossary terms. So these are terms that you will hear me talk about throughout this presentation, but also you may hear at your doctor's offices or at trial sites and so forth. So the first term is investigational, which refers to a drug or treatment that is being studied or tested for safety and effectiveness in a clinical trial. And then there's the question of drug versus treatment. So they both refer to what is being studied in a clinical trial, but the difference here is that all drugs are treatments, but not all treatments are drugs. So a treatment can be a therapy, or it can be a medical device as well that is being tested to be brought into the market. So for the context of today's presentation, I will use treatment or investigational treatment throughout. And then lastly, study versus trial. So in the context of clinical research, these two can be used interchangeably because all trials are studies, but not all studies are trials. Trials are interventional, and some studies can be observational. But for the purposes of today's presentation, I'll be using trial or clinical trials throughout. All right, so jumping into the actual content now. What are clinical trials? So clinical trials are a way to study investigational treatments to learn if they work and how safe they are. An investigational treatment can be a newly developed treatment, or it can be an existing treatment that is now being studied to be used in a different way or for a different condition entirely. So trials can include people who have a specific disease or condition that is being tested, or they can also include healthy people, so researchers can learn how safe the treatment is and how it acts in the body before they give it to the people who actually need them. So if a trial shows that a new treatment works and is safe, then it will be approved to be used by the people who need it in the public. So there are typically 4 phases of a clinical trial. Phase 1 is the investigational treatment is given to a small group of participants. The goals in this phase may be to check for safety, for effectiveness, and track any medical problems. Phase 2, the researchers check the safety of the investigational treatment and how it works in the participants with the specific disease or condition that's being studied. Phase 3, the researchers continue checking for safety and how well it works, but in a larger group of people this time, and that have the condition. And then in this phase, researchers will often include a placebo group. What's a placebo? A placebo looks like the investigational treatment, but does not contain the active ingredients that the investigational treatment contains. So it doesn't contain the medicine of the treatment. So researchers will continue to monitor health of the participants. So if your medical condition changes at all during the trial staff may recommend that you leave the trial or that you receive a different treatment. But they will only use a placebo if it is appropriate to do so. And lastly, phase 4 is that it happens when the investigational treatment is approved and made available to the public. So researchers will now follow how the treatment works in the public and its long-term effects. And I just want to mention here, and I know, I think it was Keith's presentation earlier from today, that trials are evolving, and because conditions are complex and trials are complex, there's different combinations of phases. So these are the 4 traditional phases of a clinical trial. However, you may come across trials that have phase 2A and 2B, as I think Keith's trial had. And so just a caveat there that these are the traditional phases, but there may be different combinations that you come across. And then I have a video here. I hope it'll, might not work actually. Okay, so never mind. I had a video here that was like a short clip of just the life cycle of clinical trials, but we're going to skip that. Maybe I can share a link to it later. But we'll jump right into gene therapy. So I know Florian kind of talked a lot about this earlier, so this is a repetition of that, but in a very high-level aspect. But gene therapy is the use of genetic materials to treat or prevent disease. These genetic materials may be DNA or RNA, and gene therapy can be used to treat cancer, genetic disorders, and rare diseases with limited treatment options. And there are typically 2 treatment methods that researchers use in gene therapy. The first being in vivo. So the genetic material, the DNA or RNA, is delivered directly inside the patient using a method like an injection. And then ex vivo, the doctors put the genetic material into the cell outside of the body in a lab. So they take the cell from the patient's body, take it to a lab, and transfer the DNA or RNA at the lab. So after that transfer happens, the modified cells are then put back into the patient's body. So with gene therapy, there comes some challenges. They can take a long time to complete, and the FDA approval process is long. And since gene therapies target rare diseases, there is a small pool of people with the disease. So this means that there could be challenges in finding eligible participants, and gathering research data can potentially take longer. And lastly, long-term effects of gene therapies are unknown, and because of this, researchers need to monitor patients for a while after treatment, and the monitoring can last for several years. But a general takeaway here is that, gene therapy is one of the most promising new treatments for ALD, as you may have heard from previous presentations today. But the earlier this treatment is started, the better. And the current trials are important for gathering information to learn how to bring these new therapies from research to public use. So what is a successful trial? All participants in trials help researchers learn more about a certain condition and the drug or treatment that's being studied. Even if a trial doesn't result in negative results, meaning there was no benefit of using a trial treatment for the condition, all the information gathered, including the negative results, helps further science and treatment discovery. So the success of trials depends on a few things. First being transparency, so open communication and sharing of information between staff, patients, and medical professionals to help build trust. Diversity, so including a diverse group of participants that represents those who may need the investigational treatment if approved for use. Accessibility, trials should be designed so that it is easy for people to participate. So for example, including options for home visits or virtual visits if that's possible. And lastly, design with participants. So trials created using patient and public perspectives through advisory boards can help positive participant experience. And I want to give a shout out here to ALD Connect because this advocacy group is great at connecting the public, the patients, and the industry professionals. So big shout out there. So what do trials test for? They test for primary and secondary endpoints. So endpoints measure the effects of the investigational treatment. So physical exams, blood tests, imaging scans like X-rays, CT scans can be used to measure endpoints. Endpoints can include medical events, so for example, if blood clots happen, symptoms, so if a patient has developed shortness of breath or pain, measures of function, so the inability or ability to walk. And lastly, safety. They monitor for safety or monitor for adverse events, which are unexpected health problems. So the difference between primary endpoint and secondary endpoint is that the primary endpoint is what the researchers are testing for, the primary objective. They use the primary endpoints to understand if the investigational treatment is effective in treating or preventing the condition being tested. And secondary endpoint, on the other hand, can be a medical event that happens in a trial that the trial is not designed to test. So many secondary endpoints are patient-reported outcomes, such as shortness of breath or change in ability to walk. And patients may be given, because of this, patients may be given access to diaries or electronic diaries so they can report or log any of their outcomes throughout the trial process. But in the end, both primary and secondary endpoints help paint a better picture of how an investigational treatment works. All right, so jumping into part 2, expanded access programs. So the US Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, established the expanded access programs, which allow patients access to investigational treatments outside of a clinical trial, outside of joining a clinical trial. But they must have serious or life-threatening conditions, and they must have tried all other treatment options out there and not had success. Before I move on to the types of expanded access programs, I want to ask here for a show of hands if anyone here is familiar with expanded access programs. Love to see it. Love to see it. Okay, great. So there are 3 different types. The first is individual patient programs, which allow a single patient to access an investigational treatment. There's intermediate-sized population programs, which means that more than one patient is given access to the treatment. And then there's larger patient population programs, which is for widespread usage of the investigational treatment, but this is mostly used to fill the gap between a completion of a trial and the marketing of the treatment to go to public. For the purposes of this presentation, though, I'll focus mostly on, or just on individual patient programs and the different types. And the first is compassionate use. So compassionate use can also be called expanded access. It can also be called compassionate access. So all 3 are kind of used interchangeably. And there are some eligibility criteria for compassionate use. So as I mentioned before, the patient must have a serious or life-threatening condition. There must be a lack of satisfactory treatment options. So like I mentioned, they've tried all other treatment options out there. Nothing has worked. The patient is not eligible for ongoing clinical trials. And lastly, the benefit of taking an unapproved treatment outweighs the risk of taking it. So who are the key people and what's the process of compassionate use like? So the first is the patient, who will talk to their doctor about any alternate options for receiving treatment. And then the doctor will then review any available information there is on the investigational treatment And if they feel that it is appropriate for the patient to take, they will submit written requests to the manufacturer and to an institutional review board, or the IRB. The manufacturer, or the pharmaceutical company who develops the treatment, will approve or deny the request from the doctor. If they approve it, they will then also submit a request to the FDA with any current data that they have on the safety and effectiveness of the treatment. And then the IRB, so the request that the doctor submits to the IRB will use that information and determine if the treatment is ethical for the patient to use. And lastly, the FDA offers the final approval or denial. So they will decide if the patient can access the treatment through compassionate use. So if the FDA approves the investigational treatment to be given to the patient, the doctor will then go through the informed consent process with the patient. This is a process where the doctor fully informs the patient about the investigational treatment, the potential risks and benefits of taking it, and the fact that the effectiveness of the investigational treatment is uncertain. That's because this hasn't completed clinical trials and it's not approved for the public use yet. So all in all, informed consent is a very important part of anyone's participation. So the overall benefit of compassionate use here is that it provides patients with a potentially life-saving treatment when they have no other options available to them. But with that comes some limitations. The approval process can be time-consuming, and not all manufacturers will agree to give access to the investigational treatment. So if that happens, the doctor has to go back to the drawing board and look for other alternative treatment options. And lastly, the investigational nature of the treatment means there may be unknown risks and effectiveness may vary. So this was one kind of individual patient program, compassionate use. Now we're going to talk about another one called Right to Try. And this Right to Try has a lot of similarities with compassionate use, but there are some key differences that I'm going to highlight here. So the first two is that they have two additional eligibility criteria. So first of which is the investigational treatment has completed phase 1 clinical trial at least. And then the second one is that the investigational treatment has not yet received full regulatory approval. And then additionally, with Right to Try, the manufacturer is not required to submit a request to the FDA or IRB for approval. So under Right to Try, the patient, if the manufacturer agrees to the access for the treatment, the patient can immediately access the treatment. But because of that, the manufacturer will need to submit annual reports that detail the use and safety information of the treatment to the FDA or IRB. And then the Right to Try laws differ depending on the state the patient lives in. So it's important to have discussions with your doctor about what will be required when you request investigational treatment access under this law. All right. Part 3, clinical trial delays. So we'll talk about clinical trial delays and what might cause certain delays. So one of the goals in clinical trials is to ensure that participants are protected throughout the entire process of the trial. If the safety of the participants or the ethics or scientific validity ever come into question at any point in the process, the FDA can issue a warning, delay approval of the trial start, request updates to the trial protocol, or enforce a clinical hold. What's a clinical hold? A clinical hold happens when the FDA suspends or delays a clinical trial, and there are two different types of clinical holds. The first is a complete clinical hold. So this will stop the study entirely. So no new participants can be enrolled, and any current participants may need to stop treatment if that's safe to do so. And then we have partial clinical hold. So this allows for some parts of the study to continue while pausing other parts. So for example, enrollment or certain treatments. So when are clinical trials or clinical holds enforced? That can be before or during a trial, and those scenarios can be regulatory noncompliance. So if the trial fails to comply with good clinical practice, which are guidelines from the FDA that outline the safe and ethical practices of clinical trials. Ethical considerations. So if there are increased levels of scrutiny regarding if a study includes a specifically vulnerable population. Another scenario that holds can be enforced are during a trial or before treatment approval. And examples of that are safety concerns. So if there are unexpected severe adverse events that occur. And a real life example of this, and I know we have a Bluebird bio talk later, I think right after me actually, but in 2021 they had a cerebral ALD clinical trial where a patient had a severe unexpected adverse reaction to the trial treatment. And so the FDA requested a clinical hold be put on. And then after safety measures were updated, the hold was lifted a year later in 2022, and Sky Sonar was approved by the FDA at that point. And then going back to examples of when holds are enforced, there could be protocol violations. So if the trial staff don't follow the proper informed consent process, so if they leave out important trial information. And lastly, insufficient data. So if there is a lack of evidence showing the investigational treatment may be effective. All right. So the process of a clinical hold. So as I mentioned, the FDA will notify of the need of a hold. And then the response period is when the researcher and manufacturer will then go back and follow up to correct the reasons for the hold. So, for example, if they have to revise the protocol or if they have to implement new safety measures throughout the trial. So once they go through that process, if the FDA is satisfied with the corrections, they will lift the hold. But even after they lift the hold, there may be most likely an ongoing monitoring situation where the FDA will continue to monitor the trial to ensure that there is a compliance with the revised protocol and safety issues. So the startup process of a clinical trial is long. There is a lot of planning that needs to happen before a clinical trial starts to ensure it runs smoothly, the participants are protected, and the researchers have proper tools for data collection and analysis. During this time, researchers may come across things that may delay the trial further. But delays can also happen after participants have completed their screening process or are enrolled in a trial. So for example, even after screening is complete, it may take a while for them to start taking the investigational treatment. So what can cause delays? There are 7 factors. The first are regulatory barriers. So for example, if the trial staff are waiting for feedback from the FDA, and then enrollment challenges. So if the eligibility criteria is strict for a trial, it may take a while to enroll participants into the trial. Funding or budget constraints. So if there are delays in getting grants or other funding sources. Site-related issues. So if there are administrative processes that are impacted, for example, if building contracts is impacted. If there are protocol updates needed, so if there's new information that's released about the investigational treatment that would require a protocol update, that could delay the trial start. External factors, so global events like a pandemic can delay a trial. And lastly, research team issues. So like if there are new hires that they need new training to be brought up to speed on trial protocol and procedures. But the general takeaway here is that things can pop up at any time that might cause delays in a clinical trial. So it's important that in the early planning stages, researchers think of strategies that can help work around potential challenges to keep the trials on track. All right, jumping into part 4, any other challenges clinical trials may face, and I'm going to touch on 2 different ones here. The first being premature trial termination. So the FDA, IRB, or other regulating organizations can stop a clinical trial earlier than it was originally scheduled to end. In the event a trial is stopped early, the trial sites and or the researchers must notify the trial participants, and when doing so, they must ensure the patients have a plan for follow-up with their doctors to discuss any alternative treatment options. So some reasons for early trial termination. One can be that there's evidence that the investigational treatment's effectiveness is better or worse than the researchers initially expected. There is unexpected safety issues that occurred that researchers are unable to properly measure. There is an understanding that the investigational treatment is unlikely to treat or prevent the condition that's being studied. And lastly, the study protocol does not meet study objectives. So if there is a failure to enroll participants within a specified time period that's outlined in the protocol. And then I'm going to touch on participant discontinuation. So this happens when a participant is withdrawn from a clinical trial before they complete a trial. And there's scenarios where the FDA or the researcher may withdraw a participant, but there's also participants also have the right to withdraw themselves at any point as well. So some reasons can be adverse events. So if the participant experiences serious unexpected adverse events that put their safety at risk. Protocol deviations. So if the participant does not adhere to certain protocol, the trial protocol, like missing multiple trial visits. And then loss to follow-up. So if the participant located or if the researchers can't contact them, which leads to incomplete data collection. And then lastly, like I mentioned, participant withdrawal. So the participant can choose to withdraw themselves due to their own personal reasons. So participant discontinuation can affect the outcome of a clinical trial. The data collected from each participant is important for a holistic understanding of how the investigational treatment works. Retention in a trial, as much as appropriate, is important. So the trial staff must come up with a plan on how to navigate early participant discontinuation without impacting the ongoing trial and ongoing participants too much. But like I mentioned, participants are allowed to withdraw themselves, and it is important to note that it's important that they know that they have the right to do so at any point in the process. And that's all I have today. Thank you for your attention and engagement.